In this lecture, we will be talking about fiscal policy and aggregate demand. Like monetary policy, fiscal policy is another way where policymakers can intervene in the economy. Now, first, let's try to define fiscal policy. What does it mean? So, fiscal policy refers to the government's choices regarding the overall level of government purchases or taxes. So, in fiscal policies, governments try to control the economy through government expenditure and the taxes they collect from people and firms. Now, fiscal policies can be divided into two broad categories. First is expansionary fiscal policies, which essentially means that government spending increases or tax decreases, which leads to increase in aggregate demand. And there's a contractionary fiscal policy where aggregate demand is decreased via decreased government expenditure or increased taxes. Now, question is like how these things are connected, how taxes and government expenditures are connected to aggregate demand. That I'll show you in the next slide using an example. So let's first talk about the expansionary fiscal policy where government expenditures are increased or taxes are reduced. So let's start with a long run situation. So I'll put price level on the y-axis and output or GDP on the x-axis. So first I'll draw a short-run aggregate supply which includes both the Keynesian and the neoclassical zones. So basically it's a flatter short-run aggregate supply initially and then it becomes steeper. Next I'll draw the long-run aggregate supply or potential GDP. So this is your long-run aggregate supply with potential GDP Y star. This is your potential GDP. Next, I'll draw the aggregate demand curve through long run. So it's a long run equilibrium. We'll always start with long run equilibrium and then I'll show you how recessions can happen. So in the long run, all the three curves intersect at the same point. So this is your aggregate demand and this is your long run equilibrium. Now, for some reason, suppose there's this negative supply shock, which means that your short-run aggregate supply curve has shifted left, and it can shift left because of reasons like increasing input prices, increasing labor costs, or it can be natural disaster or anything. So, for whatever reason, your short-run aggregate supply shifted left. So it shifted left to SRAS2 because of negative supply shock. As a result, we ended up in a short-run equilibrium at this point. This is your short-run equilibrium, and the new output that's reached is Y1, which is below the potential GDP. So when output is below potential GDP, your economy is in recession. As a result, unemployment is going up. So we need policy interventions to move back the economy to the full employment level. That means on LRAS or long run aggregate supply curve. Now, through fiscal policies, government can start shifting the aggregate demand to the right by either increasing government expenditure or decreasing taxes. So let's write it down here. So fiscal policies, one is increased government expenditure, which directly leads to increased aggregate demand, or decreased taxes, which leads to increased consumption. Now when taxes are decreased, which essentially means that I can take home more pay, my disposable income increases, and increased consumption leads to increased aggregate demand. So let me show you how the aggregate demand curve is going to shift. So your aggregate demand curve starts shifting right, and as a result it ends up here to AD2, and it shifted right because of expansionary fiscal policy, and we are in this new long run equilibrium, and we are back in full employment. So this is how the governments can intervene in the economy by increasing government expenditure and reduce taxes to shift the aggregate demand to the right. Now let me show you what happens if there's a contractionary monetary fiscal policy. So in the case of contraction fiscal policy, government reduce government expenditure and increase taxes to shift the aggregate demand to the left. So it's required when we are booming or economy is overheating. So we'll start with a long run situation. So I'll draw a short run aggregate supply first. Let's see a short run aggregate supply. I'll draw the long run aggregate supply next. Next, I'll draw the aggregate demand through the long run equilibrium. Now let's assume that there's a positive supply shock this time. That means your short run aggregate supply shifted right because of maybe decreasing input prices or whatever reason. This is your short run aggregate supply new, which shifted right. As a result, we reach this short run equilibrium Y1. So output is now beyond full employment. When output is beyond full employment, which means economy is overheating, and we all know that in the long run we want to be on potential GDP. Either way, if output is below full employment or if output is above full employment, it's a problem. So to rectify this problem, policymakers can intervene in the economy. In this case, they will try to bring down the aggregate demand. And the way to bring down the aggregate demand are again two ways. Either you decrease government expenditure, which leads to decrease in AD, or you increase taxes so that consumption decreases, so your aggregate demand decreases. So either way, your aggregate demand is going to shift left. So your aggregate demand curve is shifting left to AD2, it shifted left, and we are in back to new long run equilibrium, and this is your original long run equilibrium. So again, policymakers intervene to cool down the economy by controlling or managing aggregate demand, and this way they can bring down the economy to the potential GDP. So fiscal policies are relatively very effective in controlling or managing the economy, and it has been used since the Great Depression under different scenarios, which we will be talking about later when we'll be talking about policies. Now next I would like to differentiate between two kinds of fiscal policies. One is discretionary and another is automatic stabilizers. So what is a discretionary fiscal policy? These are when government passes a new law that explicitly changes overall tax or spending levels with the intent of influencing the level of overall economic activity. That means these are designed, or these are new laws which are passed to manage the economy. The great examples are 2009 stimulus package under President Obama. So this stimulus package was passed because 2008 was a financial crisis year. So to prop up the economy, 2009 stimulus package was passed to increase government expenditures and reduce taxes so that we can bring the economy back to full employment. Now there are also another kind of fiscal policies which are called automatic stabilizers. These are tax and spending rules that have the effect of slowing the rate of decrease in aggregate demand when the economy slows down and restraining aggregate demand when the economy speeds up without any additional change in legislation. So these are already in place, automatically it kicks in by the nature of the policies. Great example, unemployment insurance and food stamps. During bad times, people lose jobs. There's a recession. As a result, automatically a lot of people apply for unemployment insurance, or some of them don't need food stamp. Now, both of these policies have the potential to increase consumption, and when consumption increases, your aggregate demand increases. On the other hand, during a good time when people have jobs, that means output is beyond potential GDP or more than potential GDP, which means unemployment is very low, which essentially means that few people are applying for unemployment insurance and few people are applying for food stamp. So this has a dampening effect of reducing the aggregate demand. So these are called automatic stabilizers. These are policies already in place. And in normal times, automatic stabilizers are very effective, but when things are not that good, like the Great Recession, we need discretionary fiscal policy to be able to control the or manage the economy.